The most terrifying torture device in the history of Western civilization was never used to torture anyone. Not once. Not a single documented case. The Iron Maiden, that spike-lined coffin in the shape of a woman, that symbol of medieval sadism that's been in 100 horror movies and 1,000 history books, was a fake, a prop, a piece of theater built to make tourists gasp and pay admission. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We built it ourselves. Not in the Middle Ages, not during the Inquisition. We built it in the 1800s, during the age of steam engines and gas lamps. And then we put it in a museum and called it ancient. We told ourselves a story about how monstrous the past was, and then we manufactured the evidence to prove it. That's not a conspiracy. That's something stranger and more human than a conspiracy. That's a civilization lying to itself, and believing the lie so completely that the lie became the truth in every textbook, every film, every Halloween display from here to Los Angeles. So what actually happened in the dungeons of the Middle Ages? What did the Inquisition really do? Which instruments of suffering were real, and which ones were dreamed up by novelists and museum curators who wanted to give the crowds something to shudder at? The answers are going to flip your understanding of history upside down, because the real story is darker in some ways and far stranger in others than anything the mythmakers invented. Before we go any further, if you've been watching this channel for a while, hit subscribe and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps more than you know. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I'm always curious whether it's 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning for you when you fall down a rabbit hole like this one. All right, let's open the museum. Picture a museum in the 1800s. Not the sleek, minimalist galleries we have today, but the old kind, the Victorian kind, crammed floor to ceiling with objects meant to provoke. Gas jets hissing overhead, the smell of dust and old wood. Crowds of people in their Sunday best, pressing their noses up to glass cases filled with what the plaques told them were relics of the dark past. And in the corner, lit dramatically, loomed a life-sized figure of a woman. Cast iron, hinged down the middle, the inside of her torso bristling with iron spikes, arranged so precisely, the placard explained, that they would pierce the body of the condemned without hitting any vital organs. Death would be slow, agonizing, medieval. Except the placard was lying. The oldest known Iron Maiden was assembled in Nuremberg, which is why it's sometimes called the Nuremberg Maiden. And the evidence strongly suggests it was put together in the early 19th century, not the 16th. The director of the German National Museum examined it in 1838 and concluded it had been fabricated recently, most likely assembled from unrelated pieces of old metalwork to satisfy a market hungry for proof of medieval horror. The case against it was that simple. No medieval record mentions it being used. No execution order, no confession obtained under its threat, no chronicle, no court document. The first written description of the Iron Maiden being used as a torture device appears in a Nuremberg travel guide published in 1792, centuries after the Middle Ages ended. And that account describes a single alleged execution from 1515, with no corroboration anywhere. Then, in 1802, a Nuremberg museum put one on display, presenting it as an authentic medieval artifact. And the crowds came, and the story spread. By 1893, a copy of the device was on tour in the United States, exhibited at the World's Fair in Chicago, thrilling American audiences with visions of European barbarism. By the 20th century, it was in films, in novels, in every popular history of torture ever written. The original Nuremberg piece was destroyed in a bombing raid in 1944. What survives is an 1828 copy, now sitting in a museum in Rothenburg. You can still go see it. And the Iron Maiden isn't alone in this hall of fabrications. The pair of anguish, that grotesque, expanding device allegedly inserted into the body's orifices and cranked open, is mentioned in no medieval source either. Every surviving example in museums dates to the 19th century at the earliest. Historians who have studied medieval torture methods in detail say the mechanism would barely function anyway. The lever system was too weak to force open a real orifice against muscle resistance. It was a fantasy that someone later built into physical form. The chastity belt, that supposedly essential medieval accessory, the earliest authentic depiction appears in a book from 1405, in a section that scholars believe was satirical, filed alongside jokes and absurdist military inventions. Not a single verified medieval belt has ever been found. Every museum specimen, when examined properly, turns out to be 19th century metalwork. What happened here? Why did the 1800s generate so many fake medieval torture devices? Part of the answer is commerce. Collectors and museum directors in the Victorian era understood that people would pay to be horrified. The demand for Gothic darkness was enormous. This was the century of Frankenstein, of Gothic novels, of an entire literary movement built on the aesthetic of the dungeon and the crypt. A good Iron Maiden attracted more visitors than a case of pottery shards. So the objects appeared. Someone with workshop skills and a good sense of what the market wanted would take old pieces of metal, genuine pieces sometimes from the correct era, and assemble them into something that looked like a torture device, and put a plaque on it. But there's a deeper reason too. The 18th and 19th centuries were the age of anti-Catholic propaganda. Protestant Europe had spent 300 years building a case against Rome, against the Inquisition, against the Church as an institution of darkness and cruelty. This wasn't a fringe argument. It was mainstream. Educated men and women across Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, and the newly formed United States genuinely believed that medieval Catholic Europe had been a reign of terror, that the Inquisition had burned millions of innocent people, that torture was the central instrument of church power. And if you believe that, and someone presents you with a spike-lined coffin and tells you this is what they used, you believe it. The story confirms what you already know. Historians have a name for this. They call it the Black Legend, La Leyenda Negra, a term coined by Spanish historian Julián Juderías in 1914 to describe the systematic distortion of Spanish and Catholic history by Protestant competitors. The Black Legend painted the Inquisition as a uniquely sadistic institution, when in reality, as we're about to see, the actual historical record tells a story so different, it almost feels like it must be about a different organization entirely. Before we get there, though, you need to understand something about what the Church actually was in medieval Europe. Because without that, the truth about the Inquisition makes no sense. Think about the medieval world not as a kingdom with a church in it, but as a world where the church and the kingdom were the same thing. There was no separation of spiritual and civic authority. The church wasn't an institution that operated alongside government. It was the government's philosophical spine. Kings ruled by divine right. Laws derived from divine law. A challenge to church doctrine wasn't just a theological disagreement. It was, structurally, a challenge to the entire social order. It was as destabilizing in that world as someone today declaring that the laws of physics were suspended in their country. Every assumption that held the civilization together suddenly became uncertain. Into this world, in the early 12th century, came the Cathars, a religious movement that spread like wildfire across southern France. The Languedoc region, wealthy, sun-baked, prosperous. The Cathars held that the material world was the creation of an evil god, that the human soul was a divine spark imprisoned in corrupt flesh, and that the entire institution of the Catholic Church was therefore the apparatus of evil itself. Their leaders, the Perfecti, lived lives of such extreme asceticism that they attracted genuine admiration. They refused to eat meat. They refused to have sex. They owned nothing. Compared to the fat, worldly clergy of the local Catholic establishment, they looked like saints. By the early 1300s, they controlled enormous swaths of southern France. The local nobility protected them. The local bishops couldn't touch them. 2 papal legates were sent to reason with the heretics, and both missions failed completely. Then one of those legates, Pierre de Castelnau, was murdered on the road, allegedly by a servant of the Count of Toulouse. Pope Innocent III called a crusade. The Albigensian Crusade lasted 20 years. It was brutal on all sides. The army marching south under Simon de Montfort sacked towns, massacred populations, burned and looted across one of the most civilized regions of Europe. When the northern forces took the city of Béziers, the commander asked how to tell the heretics from the good Catholics in the population. The papal legate's alleged response, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own," may or may not be historically accurate, but it describes with devastating concision the logic of total war applied to religious dissent. After the crusade ended, the church faced a practical problem. How do you identify and deal with hidden heretics without sending an army every time? That was the origin of the Inquisition. Not a chamber of horrors, an investigative mechanism, a bureaucracy.
The word itself comes from the Latin inquisitio, meaning inquiry, investigation, a legal examination of the facts. The inquisitor was, literally, an investigator. The first inquisitors were Dominican friars. The Dominicans had been founded specifically to combat heresy through preaching and argument, and they were educated men, trained in philosophy and theology, capable of identifying a Cathar belief system through questioning, rather than just burning the first person who looked suspicious. This was, in its original conception, meant to be a more rational alternative to the mob violence and crusade-scale slaughter that had characterized the response to heresy before. The church at this time was 1,000 years old. It had seen institutions rise and fall, had survived barbarian invasions and schisms and internal corruption and external attack. It moved carefully, with an awareness that its survival depended on not making enemies it didn't have to make. The Inquisition's procedures reflected that caution in ways that will genuinely surprise you. When an inquisitor arrived in a town, the first thing he did was not arrest anyone. He announced what he called a period of grace, sometimes called a period of mercy, during which any person who had strayed into heresy could come forward voluntarily, confess, and receive a penance rather than a punishment. This period lasted several weeks. The inquisitor heard confessions, took statements, listened. Only after the period of grace ended did formal investigations begin. The procedural rules that governed inquisitorial investigations were strict. You could not be convicted on the basis of a single witness. 2 independent witnesses were required, and if their testimony contradicted each other on key points, the case collapsed. The accused had the right to know what charges had been brought against them. Confessions obtained under improper circumstances could be challenged. The inquisitor himself had no power of execution. If a verdict of guilt was reached and the punishment was death, the prisoner was formally handed over to secular authorities, because the church was prohibited by canon law from spilling blood. The numbers that emerge from the historical record are genuinely staggering in how far they fall from the myth. The Spanish Inquisition, widely regarded as the most severe, conducted roughly 49,000 trials in the period from 1505 to 1700. Of those, scholars estimate somewhere in the range of 800 executions over those nearly 2 centuries, a figure that historians including Henry Kamen and Gustav Henningsen have converged on from different archival sources, though the exact count remains debated. Read that again. 49,000 cases, fewer than 1,000 executions over nearly 2 centuries. The overwhelming majority of those brought before the tribunal received fines, penances, mandatory attendance at religious instruction, or public acts of humiliation, walking in a procession wearing a special garment marked with crosses, which was considered deeply shaming, but was not, by any physical measure, torture. Roughly 98% of all accused were either acquitted or received a non-capital sentence. Compare that to what was happening in Protestant Europe at the same time. In Germany alone, somewhere between 25,000 and 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft between 1550 and 1750, with staggeringly high rates in both Protestant territories and certain Catholic prince-bishoprics like Bamberg and Würzburg. Though across German-speaking lands as a whole, the majority of executions occurred in Protestant jurisdictions under secular courts. In the small Swiss cantons, the rate of witch executions per capita made the Spanish Inquisition look like a model of restraint.
The Salem witch trials of 1692, 13 executed, 20 convicted, took place in a Puritan colony, not a Catholic one. None of this means the Inquisition was harmless. Hundreds of people died who should not have died. Thousands more suffered imprisonment, financial ruin, social humiliation, the destruction of their families. People were tortured. We'll get to the specifics of that. And some of those tortured confessed to things they didn't do. The institution was a tool of social control. It was used by the powerful against the weak, by the orthodox against the different, and the victims were real. But the scale, the character, and the purpose of the institution are nothing like what the myth presents. The Inquisition was not a killing machine. It was a bureaucratic system for enforcing doctrinal conformity that, by the standards of its own time and compared directly to the secular alternatives operating simultaneously, was notably reluctant to spill blood. And the further you dig into that fact, the harder it becomes to avoid asking a question that doesn't appear in any popular history. If the Church was so cautious about killing, what were the actual torture methods that inquisitors and secular courts used? And which ones are real, documented in court records, described in procedure manuals, confirmed by confessions and notarial accounts? Because the answer divides the world of medieval suffering into two halves that don't look anything like each other. One half, the Iron Maiden, the pear, the spike-lined coffin, belongs entirely to the 19th century's imagination. The other half, the rack, the strappado, the thumbscrew, the legally regulated ordeal of water, is documented in painstaking bureaucratic detail because the people who used these methods recorded everything, every session, every question, every answer, and those records survived. They are sitting in archives right now, waiting to tell you what actually happened. The notary was present at every session, every question asked, every answer given, every physical action taken was committed to paper in a bound register that was then archived, numbered, and stored. These documents survived wars and fires and the collapse of empires, and are now being digitized so researchers can read them from laptops in Chicago and Berlin. And what they contain is a portrait of judicial violence so specific, so procedurally detailed, so utterly unlike the Gothic fantasy of the Iron Maiden, that it forces you to completely rebuild your mental image of what suffering in that era actually looked like. Forget the spike-lined coffin. Forget the mechanical monstrosity designed to pierce without killing. The actual instruments of judicial torture were shockingly simple, and that simplicity, once you understand it, is its own kind of horror. Take the strappado. No elaborate machinery, no custom-built iron contraption, just a rope, a pulley, and the human body's own weight
turned against itself. The prisoner's hands were bound behind their back, wrists together, palms outward. The rope was threaded through a pulley fixed to the ceiling. Then the prisoner was hoisted, suspended entirely by their wrists, their arms wrenched into an unnatural angle behind their back. In the basic form of the strappado, you were simply left hanging there, the weight of your own body pulling your shoulders toward dislocation. In the aggravated form, and the court records use exactly that word, aggravated, as though we were reading a legal filing, which we are, weights were attached to the feet, multiplying the strain on the shoulder joints. And then, sometimes, you were dropped. Not to the ground, just enough. A sudden fall stopped short, the rope snapping taut. The jerk dislocated the shoulders in an instant, sometimes both simultaneously. In the records of the Roman Inquisition, this moment has its own procedural name, the territio verbalis, warning torture, designed to produce confession by the threat of pain, and then the territio realis, actual torture, which is the application itself. The notary wrote down how many drops were administered. 1, 2, 3. The number mattered legally because there were limits. You could only torture a subject once per session, and the total number of sessions was capped. These limits were real constraints, documented and enforced, though, and this matters enormously, the definition of a single session was sometimes stretched with creative interpretation. The strappado appears in inquisitorial records from the 13th century onward. It appears in secular court records across France, Italy, the German states, Spain, Portugal. It is not a theory or an inference. It is documented torture, real torture, practiced on real people who cried out in real pain, while a man in a dark room wrote down everything they said, in case any of it was useful. And pay attention to what that means in practice.
The strappado was brutal precisely because it required nothing exotic. Any building with a ceiling beam could become a torture chamber. Any town had rope. The technology of suffering was universal, portable, available everywhere. Which means it was everywhere. Not locked inside some Gothic castle visible from a mile away. In courthouses, in the back rooms of civic halls, in ordinary stone buildings on ordinary streets, in ordinary European towns. Now slide your attention 6 inches, because right next to the strappado in the Inquisitor's procedural toolkit was something physically smaller, legally distinct, and in some ways psychologically worse. The thumbscrew. Unlike the Iron Maiden, unlike the Pair of Anguish, unlike the elaborate mechanical fantasies of the Victorian imagination, the thumbscrew is real. Genuinely, documentably, unambiguously real. Specimens have been recovered from genuine archaeological contexts. Court records from Scotland, from the Low Countries, from the territories of the Holy Roman Empire explicitly mention their use. The device appears in inquisitorial manuals. It was standard equipment in the Scottish Privy Council's interrogation repertoire well into the 17th century, used not by medieval torturers in robes, but by bureaucrats in office buildings making decisions about political prisoners. The mechanism was straightforward, to the point of cruelty in its simplicity. 2 flat bars of metal, hinged or slotted, pressed the thumb, or multiple fingers, or in more aggressive variants the entire foot, between them. A screw mechanism, turned by hand, tightened the bars. Slowly. The torturer controlled the rate completely. 1 quarter turn. A pause. Another quarter turn. The pressure built in a way that was, by deliberate design, entirely controllable, which meant the torturer could calibrate the pain precisely, easing off when the subject seemed about to lose consciousness, increasing when the subject seemed to be enduring. The psychological dimension of this was understood and intentional. Inquisitorial theory,
And yes, there was a genuine, developed theory of torture, articulated by legal scholars and theologians who debated it in writing over centuries, held that the purpose of judicial torture was not punishment. It was information extraction. Causing pain purely for suffering's sake was considered sinful and was technically prohibited. Pain was supposed to overcome the will's resistance to truth-telling. This meant the ideal torture was controlled, graduated, responsive to the subject's reactions, not a spectacle of gore. A managed conversation conducted through physical duress. Which sounds, put that way, almost clinical. Until you remember that the subject was a human being, with fingers being slowly crushed between iron plates, in a cold room, surrounded by strangers writing down everything they said.
Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who left extraordinarily detailed records of his time in New Spain, wrote about torture in terms that reflected mainstream church legal doctrine. The goal was truth, and truth required a confession freely given, which meant a confession obtained by torture had to be ratified afterward, freely, without coercion, before it was legally valid. This ratification requirement was genuine. It appears throughout inquisitorial procedure. After torture, the prisoner was brought back to the courtroom and asked to confirm what they had said. And what happened, overwhelmingly, in case after documented case, was that the prisoner walked out of the torture session, returned to their cell, and then the next morning told the inquisitor, "I said it." But it wasn't true. They recanted. At which point, legally, the inquisitor faced a problem. A confession obtained under torture that was then recanted was worthless as evidence. But the inquisitorial manual had an answer for this, too. A circular solution so logically vicious, it almost takes your breath away. A recantation after torture could itself be treated as evidence of obstinacy. The prisoner was considered to be under diabolical influence, lying again, and the torture could be resumed. Not as a new session. Technically, it was the continuation of the previous session, merely interrupted. This legal fiction allowed the same individual to be tortured multiple times while staying within the procedural rule that torture could only be applied once. The person who documented this problem most honestly was a man named Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld, a German Jesuit priest who served as a confessor to accused witches in the 1620s. He accompanied condemned prisoners to their executions. He held their hands. He watched them burn. And in 1631, he published a book called Cautio Criminalis, roughly, Precautions for Criminal Prosecutors, that stands as one of the most devastating internal critiques of judicial torture ever written by someone inside the system. The book appeared without his name on it. Spee's authorship was an open secret among Jesuit circles almost immediately, though it wasn't confirmed publicly until decades after his death. Spee had watched the machine devour person after person who he was absolutely certain was innocent. He wrote with barely contained fury about the logic of the torture confession cycle. You torture a person until they confess. They confess to save themselves from further torture. You ask them to name their accomplices. They name people, anyone, someone they dislike, someone who looked at them oddly in the market, because naming accomplices might shorten their ordeal. Those people are arrested. Those people are tortured. Those people also confess and name accomplices. And so the circle expands, geometrically, consuming the innocent alongside any actual guilty party, producing confessions that are factually absurd, accusations of flying through the night air, of kissing the devil's posterior at Sabbath meetings, of transforming into wolves. Confessions that no rational court should have accepted, but that were recorded, filed, and acted upon, because the system had no internal mechanism for stopping itself. Spee's conclusion was stark. If you put him to the question, if you tortured him, Friedrich Spee, Jesuit priest, confessor of the innocent, he would confess to being a witch too. Not because he was one, because torture doesn't produce truth. It produces whatever the tortured person believes the torturer wants to hear. He was one of the first to make this argument in systematic, published form. He wasn't alone in feeling it, but he was rare in having the courage to write it down and put it into the world. He spent the rest of his life under a cloud of institutional suspicion. He died in 1635 of a fever contracted while nursing plague victims, which is the kind of life a man of genuine conscience tends to lead. The tragedy embedded in Spee's book, the weight that presses on you after you've sat with it, is that he was arguing against something that the system's own architects had already recognized as a flaw. The inquisitors were not, in the main, stupid men. They knew confession under torture was unreliable. Their procedural solution, the ratification requirement, the limits on sessions, the two-witness rule, was a genuine attempt to build error correction into a fundamentally broken machine. But the machine's purpose and its method were in irresolvable conflict. If you believe that heresy is an invisible, spiritual crime committed by people who have every reason to lie about it, and you believe that confession is the only true proof of guilt, then you have already committed yourself to torture as a method before you've asked a single question. The procedure didn't constrain the torture, it legitimized it. Now, the Inquisition that no popular history has ever really prepared you to understand was not one institution. It was three, at minimum, and they were so different from each other in their methods, their cultures, and their outcomes that lumping them together is like describing the New York Police Department and the Taliban as the same organization, because both enforce rules of conduct. The medieval Inquisition of the 12th and 13th centuries, directed primarily against the Cathars and later the Waldensians, was run by traveling Dominican and Franciscan friars operating under papal authority, but with extremely limited resources, no permanent headquarters, and no prison system of their own. When they needed to imprison someone, they had to rely on local lords or bishops to provide the cells. Their procedural consistency varied enormously by region and by the individual character of the specific inquisitor. Bernard Guy, the Inquisitor of Toulouse from 1307 to 1323, conducted 930 trials over 16 years and handed down 42 death sentences, roughly 4.5% of his total caseload. Compared to a secular court trying ordinary crimes in the same period, this was low. The Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478 by the Spanish crown, not the papacy, this is crucial, was a royal institution operating on behalf of Ferdinand and Isabella, later the Habsburg monarchs, directed primarily at conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity who were suspected of secretly continuing their original religious practices. It had a permanent bureaucracy, a network of district tribunals, detailed procedural manuals, and a system of internal appeal. Accused individuals could and did successfully appeal verdicts. Surviving records show that the Central Tribunal in Madrid overturned lower court decisions, including capital sentences, on procedural grounds. The torture sessions were brief. 15 minutes was standard, and sessions lasting longer than an hour were technically prohibited. And the majority of accused never faced torture at all. Henry Charles Lee, who spent decades in the archives producing his monumental multi-volume history of the Inquisition, and approached Rome with the skepticism of a committed Protestant scholar, nonetheless concluded from the actual records that the Spanish Inquisition was more merciful than the secular courts by the standards of its time. Then there is the Roman Inquisition, established in 1542, which operated primarily in Italy and prosecuted not mass heresy movements, but individual cases of theological nonconformity, scandalous books, forbidden ideas. People like Galileo Galilei, whose case you almost certainly know, whose punishment was house arrest and the requirement to recant, which he did, and who then lived for another 9 years, writing some of his most important work from his villa in Arcetri. The Roman Inquisition almost never executed. Its records, opened to researchers by the Vatican in 1998, partially at first, with fuller access following in subsequent years, show a pattern of investigation, warning, house arrest, and penance rather than burning. These 3 institutions operated across 4 centuries, in different countries, under different political pressures, with different priorities and different records. The image that collapses them all into a single chamber of horrors, the black-robed figures, the Iron Maiden in the corner, the screaming victim, is not derived from the evidence. It's derived from Protestant polemical literature of the 16th and 17th centuries, amplified by Gothic novels of the 18th, and finally given physical form by the museum builders of the 19th, who assembled the Iron Maiden from salvaged metalwork and told paying visitors it was medieval. Which makes you wonder, not just what the truth was, but who exactly decided you shouldn't know it? Who built the theater of horror? Who painted the sets and constructed the props? And what they were selling when they handed you the ticket? Because the people who created the myth of the Iron Maiden weren't working in darkness. They were working in the full light of the industrial age, in front of crowds, for profit, with a very clear understanding of what audiences wanted to feel and why they wanted to feel it. And once you start looking at them, the showmen, the collectors, the Gothic novelists, the propagandists with printing presses, the question of what medieval torture actually was gets replaced by a stranger and more unsettling question. What does it tell us about ourselves that we needed these monsters so badly, we built them with our own hands? Nobody hid it from you. That's what makes this so much harder to sit with than a conspiracy. Nobody suppressed the medieval court records. Nobody locked away the torture manuals or classified the inquisitorial archives. The documents were sitting in libraries and church repositories across Europe for centuries, available to any scholar who wanted to look. The Vatican opened its Inquisition archives in 1998, and what historians found wasn't a cache of hidden atrocities. It was paperwork. Meticulous, procedurally obsessive, administratively mundane paperwork. Trial transcripts, appeal records, letters between tribunals arguing about jurisdiction, expense accounts listing what it cost to feed prisoners. The machinery of the Inquisition was committed to paper in exhaustive detail. And that documentation, when you actually read it, dismantles the myth so completely that the only real question is why we never looked.
The answer to that question turns out to be simpler and more damning than any conspiracy. We didn't look because we didn't want to. We had a story we needed to be true, and the story was so satisfying, so perfectly shaped to confirm what we already believed about the past and about ourselves, that checking it felt unnecessary. Why examine the evidence when you already know what it shows? So let's examine the evidence. Let's start with what doesn't exist.
There is not a single medieval document, not one court record, not one execution order, not one inquisitor's logbook, not one city chronicle, not one letter, not one notarial register that mentions the Iron Maiden being used as an instrument of torture or execution. You understand what that means in context. These courts recorded everything. The strappado session, where 3 drops were administered on the afternoon of March the 14th, in the register. The thumbscrew applied for 20 minutes before the accused requested to speak, in the register. The names of the witnesses present, the name of the notary, the name of the official who authorized the session, all of it preserved in bound volumes that survived wars and fires and the collapse of empires, and are now being digitized so researchers can read them from laptops in coffee shops in Chicago and Berlin. And nowhere in any of it does an Iron Maiden appear. The first time the device surfaces in any written source as something actually used on a human being is in that 1792 Nuremberg travel guide, a tourist document, a piece of promotional writing for a city trying to attract curious visitors. Even that account describes a single alleged case from nearly 3 centuries earlier and cites no source whatsoever.
It's a ghost story, dressed up as history. The kind of claim that exists in exactly one place and cannot be traced backward to anything real. What happened next is a masterclass in how a myth acquires the texture of fact simply by being repeated. The travel guide entry was cited by the next writer, who added detail. That writer was cited by the next, who added more. By the time the device appeared in a formal museum display in 1802, the citation chain was long enough to look impressive. But if you followed it all the way back, you arrived at a single anonymous sentence in a tourist pamphlet with no underlying evidence. The scholarly-looking footnote at the bottom of the page, the one that felt like proof, was pointing at another footnote, pointing at another footnote, pointing at nothing. The physical objects themselves tell the same story. When conservators and materials historians have examined Iron Maiden specimens properly, using metallurgical analysis, examining the methods of construction, assessing the consistency of wear patterns and the type of iron used, what they find, repeatedly, is that the pieces don't match each other. A head cast in one era, a torso assembled from parts of different objects, hinges of a different metal than the frame, interior spike mechanisms that show no evidence of use and, in several cases, would be mechanically incapable of functioning as described. The hinge geometry wrong, the clearances too tight, the internal dimensions too small to contain a human body in the closed position. These weren't instruments of torture. They were furniture. Assembled objects, installations, built to tell a story, not to do a job. Johann Philipp Dunge, the Heidelberg archivist who examined the Nuremberg specimen in the early 19th century, put it directly. The object appeared to have been constructed from disparate pieces of old metalwork that had no original relationship to each other. He was a careful man, a professional, and he said so in writing. His assessment was noted. It was filed. And then, over the following decades, it was ignored entirely by a culture that had already decided what the Iron Maiden was and saw no reason to be confused by an archivist's report. Because something was happening in the world during those decades that you cannot understand the invention of the Iron Maiden without grasping completely. The 1800s were the century of the museum as theatre, not the hushed educational spaces we associate with the word today, but loud, crowded, commercially aggressive exhibitions designed to provoke strong reactions in paying audiences. P.T. Barnum's American Museum in New York, open from 1841 to 1865, exhibited a Fiji mermaid, which was the stitched-together upper body of a monkey sewn onto the lower half of a fish, displayed behind glass with elaborate signage explaining its exotic origins.
Barnum knew it was a fabrication. His audiences, on some level, knew it too. But the transaction between showman and crowd wasn't about truth. It was about the pleasure of being shown something extraordinary, the willing suspension of disbelief in exchange for a frisson of the genuinely strange. The European curiosity cabinets and torture museums operated on exactly the same principle, with a thin, scholarly veneer laid over the commercial core. The Iron Maiden went on display in Nuremberg, and visitors came. Copies were made and exhibited. A specimen traveled to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 and drew enormous crowds of Americans who stood in line to look at it, to feel the chill of it, to go home and tell their neighbors what they'd seen. The exhibit materials described it as a genuine medieval artifact. Nobody was in a position to contradict this, because the academic literature was sparse, and the newspapers weren't running investigative pieces about metallurgical inconsistencies in torture museum displays. The object existed. It was old-looking. An authority figure said it was real. That was enough. But there was something else being sold alongside the ticket, and this is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. The torture museum wasn't just entertainment. It was argument. Every Iron Maiden, every fake pair of anguish, every fabricated chastity belt on display in a glass case was making an implicit claim about history, about religion, about civilization itself. The message encoded in the display was, "Look at what Catholic medieval Europe did. Look at the darkness we have escaped. Look at how far we have come." This message landed with particular force in Protestant countries and in the United States, where anti-Catholic sentiment was not a fringe position, but a mainstream cultural assumption. When waves of Irish and Italian Catholic immigrants arrived in America in the mid-19th century, the reaction from established Protestant communities was frequently hostile, and part of that hostility expressed itself through exactly this kind of historical argument. Catholicism was a religion of darkness, of dungeons, of the Iron Maiden. The Torture Museum wasn't separate from that argument. It was evidence for it. The Iron Maiden was a political object, masquerading as a historical one. The scholars who actually read the archives and reached different conclusions had limited power against this. Henry Charles Lee, whose multi-volume history of the Inquisition drew on decades of archival work, nonetheless concluded from the actual records that the popular image of the institution was wildly distorted. Henry Kamen, whose work in the late 20th century drew on newly available Spanish Inquisition records, reached similar conclusions. Gustav Henningsen and Jaime Contreras analyzed a sample of 44,000 Spanish Inquisition trials and found that less than 2% resulted in execution. These findings were published in academic journals and scholarly monographs. They reached historians and graduate students. They did not reach the audiences who were still watching movies where hooded figures operated elaborate torture machinery in candlelit stone chambers. Because the showmen had gotten there first. The showmen always get there first. What real suffering looked like in the medieval and early modern period, the actual texture of it, the documented reality, was in almost every way more mundane and more systemic than the myth. Not a single dramatic machine. A cold cell. Weeks or months of imprisonment before trial, during which the accused ate badly, slept badly, lived with uncertainty and fear that the documents describe but cannot fully convey. The psychological pressure of the inquisitorial interview, a trained interrogator, educated in rhetoric and theology, asking questions that were structured to circle closer and closer to the desired admission. The public penance, the San Benito, that yellow garment marked with crosses and flames, worn in procession through the streets of your own town, in front of your neighbors, your family, your creditors, the people who would decide afterward whether to do business with you or rent you a house. For those who did face physical torture, the experience was brutal and brief.
15 minutes, 30 minutes, rarely more. In a room with a notary and an official observer and a physician present to ensure the subject didn't die. Not because the authorities cared about the subject's well-being, but because a subject who died under torture was a legal and administrative problem. The death had to be explained, documented, justified. It created paperwork. The goal was a living person who could stand in court and confirm their confession and be sentenced publicly in a ceremony that communicated the power of the institution to the watching community. That is what the suffering was for. Not the spike-lined coffin, not the Gothic spectacle. Suffering was a tool with a specific purpose inside a specific bureaucratic and political system, and it was administered with the methodical attention that bureaucratic systems give to their tools. When it produced the desired result, a signed, ratified confession, it stopped. When it didn't produce the result, the rules technically required it to stop anyway, though those rules were bent with the creative legal fictions we've already seen. The mundanity of it is what strikes you when you read the documents directly. The notary's handwriting doesn't change when recording a torture session. The same, even, professional script that records a witness's name and occupation records that the accused was suspended from the pulley twice and made certain statements. The ink is the same. The page looks the same. There is no Gothic darkness in the physical artifact. Just a ledger, just a record, just the administrative product of a system processing human beings through its machinery, with the dispassion of any large organization processing anything. That dispassion, that bureaucratic ordinariness, is, in the end, far more frightening than anything the Iron Maiden implies. The Iron Maiden says, "These were monsters." The court records say, "These were officials." They had titles and salaries and procedures and lunch breaks. They went home afterward. They had families. The torture happened in the middle of working days, between other administrative tasks, conducted by people whose job it was, who had been trained to do it, who did it the way you do any skilled professional task, with attention to technique and an awareness of the rules. The myth of the medieval torture chamber lets us off the hook. It locates evil in a remote past, in shadowy figures with iron technology and hooded robes, in an age we have definitively left behind. The Iron Maiden says, "That was then, and we are now, and the distance between us is total." You can look at the spike-lined coffin behind glass and feel not implicated. You are a visitor to that darkness, not a resident of it. The court records deny us that comfort. They put the suffering in daylight, on paper, in bureaucratic prose, administered by educated professionals who believed they were doing something necessary and legitimate. They put it in a context we can recognize: the institution, the procedure, the authority of the state, because those things are not remote. They are not medieval. They are the permanent furniture of organized civilization, available to be turned towards suffering whenever the people in charge decide that the goal justifies the method. Friedrich Spee saw this. He sat with the condemned, held their hands, watched them walk to the fire, confessing to things that never happened. And he understood that the mechanism wasn't a medieval aberration. It was a human one. Put the right pressure on the right person in the right system, and you will get any confession you want. The technique works in a dungeon in 1520. It works in an interrogation room in 1950. It works in a black site in 2003. The Iron Maiden, with its elaborate spikes and its dramatic shape, suggests that producing false confessions requires specialized equipment. The strappado, a rope, a pulley, a ceiling beam,
a man with a pen, suggests something rather more portable. Spee published his book in 1631 and then went to nurse plague victims and then died. His argument took roughly another 2 centuries to become anything like consensus. The torture of judicial suspects was not abolished in most European states until the late 18th century. Not because the medieval world suddenly became modern, but because Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria made the argument in terms that political elites were finally ready to hear, in an era when the legitimacy of the church courts had already been fatally undermined, and secular governments were looking for ways to distinguish themselves from the old order. And then, almost immediately afterward, the old order was turned into a museum exhibit. Which is why the myth refuses to die. It doesn't survive because people are ignorant, though many are. It doesn't survive because the scholarship hasn't been done, though it remains underread. It survives because it is doing something that the truth cannot do. It is giving us a safe place to put the horror. A spike-lined coffin in a museum case, clearly labeled medieval, clearly located in the past, safely behind glass. That horror is containable.
You can look at it, feel the appropriate chill, and walk back out into the afternoon and feel the sun on your face and know that you live in a different world than the one that built that thing. But you don't walk out of the archive feeling that way. You walk out of the archive knowing that the notary's handwriting didn't change, that the official observer was present to ensure procedure was followed, that the physician waited outside, that somewhere a functionary was writing an expense account detailing the cost of rope and the fee paid to the man who operated the pulley. You walk out knowing that the real history of suffering isn't a collection of Gothic machines. It's a stack of ledgers in an even hand, written by people who thought they were doing their jobs. And the thing you cannot unknow once you know it is this. The Iron Maiden was built in the 19th century by people who looked at the documentary record of real, methodical, bureaucratic violence and decided that wasn't frightening enough. They needed a monster. They built one, and we have been grateful ever since.